So welcome. I'm Pastor Tim Westermeyer, the senior pastor here at St. Philip the Deacon, and on behalf of this congregation, it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to this space. I'm invested in this topic in a couple of ways. One, I'm a second career pastor, so I spent a long time in the world of communications at big PR agencies in Minneapolis and in Los Angeles. So I walked in the shoes of business people for many years and enjoyed that. I wouldn't trade it for anything. The other is I'm a board member of Anselm House, now what used to be McLaurin Institute and McLaurin CSF. So it's nice to have an event here on this site. Logistically, I've been told to say a couple things. One, we have a lot of food, so keep eating. Also, if you need a bathroom break, you will find the nearest bathroom straight down this hallway and take a left, and all the way on the west side of this lower level you'll find the bathrooms. At this point, my job is simply to introduce the executive director of Anselm House, who is Brian Bateman. So will you welcome him with a round of applause.
Applause even. Wonderful. Well, good morning. So I'm Brian. If I haven't met you, I would love to meet you, so maybe track me down during one of our breaks. I'm the director of Anselm House. Some of you, I've actually talked with some of you that are like, what's Anselm House? So we changed our name, I think, almost exactly 2 weeks ago, McLaurin Institute, that became McLaurin CSF through a ministry merger, and then we were sort of in a long search for a name. Landed on the name Anselm House. You might ask, who's Anselm? What's Anselm? So Anselm was an 11th century bishop in the church and a theologian, and is remembered by those who remember him for a relatively well-known prayer that centers on a very short line, and the line in the prayer that's really significant to us is the line, unless I believe, I shall not understand. Unless I believe, I shall not understand. And so it's this relating of faith and learning, or faith and understanding, faith and knowledge, that is key to us. And it's really a lovely motto, if you can go there, a lovely motto for Christians working in a university context. Unless I believe, I shall not understand. To see the world, to see our work, to see our studies in light of Christ and the gospel. So Anselm House inspires our mission of connecting faith and knowledge with all of life. And particularly, we want to do that at our region's premier research university. So that's our work. That's what we do. If you would like to know more about our work, I think we have some materials back out there in the hallway. Andrew Hansen is our program director. He's on our staff. You can ask him questions. And Erin is our assistant program director. She's on our staff. And so all three of us would love to talk with you if you'd like to know more. It's a delight, a pleasure to recognize and introduce to you a couple partnering ministries and churches, congregations. You've heard from Tim at St. Philip the Deacon Church, where you are. I'm shocked by how lovely this venue is and how perfect it is for our purposes. So we're very grateful for you, Tim, and the church. Two other congregations, one here on the west side and one far on the east side, are partnering with us, helping to make this happen. Good Shepherd Presbyterian Church, which is just down on Highway 12, is it? That 394 turns into 12, is partnering, and very grateful. I think, did they bring the food? Did you all bring the food? Yeah. So thank you, Good Shepherd. And then Crosswinds Community Church all the way in Stillwater. And we're very grateful to Rob Olszewski and that congregation. And then three other organizations are helping to make this possible. The Christian Investors Financial, which is a group that helps churches literally expand their space. And so if that's of interest to you, Scott Noble's out there. Scott, you're kind of in the hallway, but there he is. Thanks, Scott. Track him down. Bethel Seminary's Made to Flourish Network, and Tessa is here. I'm sorry. Yeah, Bethel Seminary's Work with Purpose initiative that has had a long conversation with the third sponsor. If you want to know more about that initiative, see Tessa. And then the Made to Flourish Pastors Network, and Aaron is representing the Pastors Network. If you're interested in this faith at work movement, you should connect with both of these individuals in the back there, and us as well. Sometimes I describe our work as kind of the collegiate arm of the faith and work movement, and we're really, we think it's not just a movement, it actually changes it's sort of unpacking really the gospel for our whole lives. So we have an email sign up if you're interested in knowing more. I think I talked with a couple of you who are interested in getting on the Anselm House email announcements to find out about more events like this that are happening in the community and at the university. Sign up on this email sign up sheet. As a special incentive to get on our list, we're giving away 2 copies of Jeff's book to some happy winners. Just sign up for that as it goes by. And so now I have the privilege of introducing Jeff Van Duzer to you. I first met Jeff when he was Dean of the School of Business and Economics and Professor of Business Ethics and Business Law at Seattle Pacific University shortly after he published his book, Why Business Matters to God. Meeting Jeff and reading his book made me want to share him and the framework that you're going to hear this morning with every business person and business student I know, which is why we're always happy to have our paths cross as it is these last few days. Under Jeff's leadership, the school opened its Center for Integrity in Business, which I commend to you if you're interested in that concept, Center for Integrity of Business. Write that little phrase down and Google it. Lots of wonderful resources there. And Jeff helped launch the Social Venture Plan competition at the business school and began a new graduate program focused on social and sustainable business, among many other accomplishments. Prior to his tenure at SPU, Jeff was a partner with the international law firm Davis Wright Tremaine, where he practiced law for more than 20 years. And he concentrated his practice in commercial finance and natural resources. He earned his undergraduate degree in rhetoric from Berkeley and a JD from Yale Law School. He is married to Margie and has 2 adult sons. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you.
See, I turned myself on, I think. Okay. Great. Hey, it's great to be here. What a privilege for me, and I'm delighted that you all would take so much time out of your Saturday to come gather around these ideas. I used to be the dean of the business school and am now been moved over into the office of the provost, and just had a lot of positive things or blessings along the way. But one of the real negatives about it is that it just leaves me with a lot less time to think and read and write and speak on this topic that I'm so really passionate about, this thing that I've come to call a theology of business. And I want to say a little bit more about what I mean by that, but let me open us in a word of prayer, if I might. Lord, I'm so grateful that you inhabit all the aspects of our lives, that you never cut us loose to go off on our own, and that you care about the full dimensions of life here. I pray that you would open our eyes, make our hearts soft, that we would receive this morning the very words that you have for us, that they would be particularly your words for this time, for this day, for this people. And I pray that there be good and rich conversation around the tables and good interactions with one another. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So I want to talk about this thing, a theology of business. And really what I mean when I use that phrase is a kind of a shorthand way of just lumping in sort of big macro level questions about business. From God's perspective, why does business matter? What are sort of boundary conditions business should respect? How does God think about the market? What is, if there's business and other institutions in society, how does God intend for them to interact? These kind of high-level questions, and I end up summarizing them just in this catchphrase, theology of business. So before I turn to some of these questions, I want to look at a couple of them today with you. But before I turn, I want to tell you a little bit about why it is that I am so passionate, or at least a part of this. And it comes out of my time as the dean of the business school. As you might guess, a big part of my job as a dean was connecting the business school to the business community. And our school, university, is a Christian university, our business school, Christian business school. And so very often I was connecting with Christians in business. And so over more than a decade, I had really probably hundreds of lunches, breakfasts, coffees, dinners. And of course, every one of them was wonderful and unique in its their own right. But after I stand back and look over a decade of them, I realized that there were certain themes or trends that emerged. And so I want to share with you three of these themes that I think shaped my passion around this topic. The first is quite simply that it seemed to me many Christians had a very, and with some happy exceptions, had a very well-developed business worldview, a kind of a Wall Street Journal orientation on life, but by contrast, a fairly anemic Christian worldview, a pretty thin or surface theology. And so that was kind of one of my takeaways. The second one that I took away is there was often among Christians in business a real diminished sense of purpose. And one of the ways that this would come up is I might ask Christians, how do you see your work contributing to God's kingdom efforts in the world? And very often what I would get back from them is something like this. I would say, well, you know, Jeff, I make a lot of money, and I use the money to, do good things. I use the money to, care for the poor, or support my church, send a missionary abroad, or, support a parachurch. I do good things with my money. And of course, I want to honor that because, God calls us to be good stewards of the wealth that God entrusts to us. But when I'm in a snide mood, sometimes I want to point out that even bank robbers can tithe. And, and the mere fact that you're doing something good with your money doesn't say anything about the underlying stuff itself. And what seemed to be so often missing was some sense that the actual day-to-day business stuff, buying, selling, setting up supply chains, reading balance sheets, hiring, firing, the nuts and bolts of business, that in and of itself, intrinsically, not just instrumentally, had some importance in God's kingdom agenda. And it seemed to me many Christians didn't see that. And so then the third one that I would say is I ended up feeling like there was often what I would characterize as kind of a dangerous dualism among Christians in business. And this would show up this way. I would ask this question. I would say, how is it as a Christian you end up doing business differently because you're a Christian? And here what I would often find is some version of, well, Jeff, business is business. It's kind of like chemistry. You take the two atoms of hydrogen, one atom of oxygen, and you put them together, you're going to get a molecule of water, and it really doesn't matter if you're a Christian chemist or a non-Christian chemist. And business is like that. Everybody kind of has to do business the same way. But because I'm a Christian, I try to be a little nicer. So when I'm in a snide mood, I refer to this one as Enron with a smile. And this I say because what it implies is that business is this sort of immutable force. It's kind of almost like gravity. And all we can do is kind of bring our best selves to it, kind of wrap it with niceness, but business itself is a given, and that's just not true. Business is a social construct, and God cares a lot about how it is constructed. And the reason I say this is a dualism is because a lot of these folks that I'm speaking to have been Christians for a long time. They're very sincere in their faith. They have Jesus as their Lord. They're on board with the whole thing, and they recognize that the Lordship of Christ has significant implications for how they behave in their family, how they behave in their neighborhood, how they behave in their church, and even how they behave in the workplace at an interpersonal level. But when I say to them something like, how do you think Jesus felt about that price point you just set? They kind of look at me like, well, Jeff, that's just business. And it's like there's this sphere over here where Jesus is Lord, and then there's, business. And that's bad and dangerous theology. There's a great Abraham Kuyper, who was a Dutch philosopher and politician and theologian. Imagine that in our current climate. Wouldn't that be wonderful? He once famously said, "There is not a square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, 'Mine.'" Or as I used to hear all the time as I was growing up, if Jesus Christ is not Lord of all, then he's not Lord at all. And so as I thought about these various themes and trends that came out of these conversations, it struck me that what was desperately needed is a rich, deep, robust theology that on the one hand can affirm the importance of the day-to-day business activities as having intrinsic kingdom value, but at the same time that has enough backbone that it can critique some of the dominant paradigms of business where they are out of alignment with God's values. And so that sense of need is part of what has driven me in this area and part of what I hope we can talk about together today. So let me start by talking about what I'm not talking about. I'm not going to talk about what you might think of as personal ethics. That is, you should act with integrity, you should be respectful, kind, and so on. Not because that's unimportant. It's critically important. It may even be more important than the rest of the stuff I'm talking about. There's a lot on this. You hear about this a lot. I'm just not going to talk about that today. The other thing I'm not going to talk about is what I would characterize as the instrumental value of business. It is true that business generates wealth, and a lot of times that wealth is put to really good purposes. That's a great thing. Sometimes people talk about, I want to have a business so I can have a platform where I can share my faith with coworkers. That's a great thing. I want to have a business because it'll allow me access to some closed countries that aren't open to the Christian faith. That's a great thing. Those are all what I would characterize as instrumental values that come out of business. Not denigrating them at all, just they're not my topic for today. So I'm not going to talk about those either. Okay? So what I want to talk about is kind of more at the heart and core of intrinsic business value and two big questions. First, why? And then how? Why does business matter from God's perspective? And then how should business be done? Sometimes I recast those in terms of the language of purpose and practice. So I want to start with purpose, and that'll be kind of my main focus of this first talk, and then the second talk will turn our attention to a little bit to practice. So when I'm talking about purpose, I want you to imagine God sitting in heaven with a big blank piece of paper on God's lap. You have to imagine that God has a lap, which might be a little stretch. But, and what God is going to write on this piece of paper is a mission statement, not for any one business, but for the institution of business as a whole. And our question is, what's God going to put on that piece of paper? I remember once trying to explain this to my dad. My dad is this mild-mannered professor of electrical engineering. He's actually recently retired, but I was telling him, the faculty and I were wrestling with this question of purpose. And my dad interrupts me. I mean, really, a very uncharacteristic for him. He interrupts me and he says, "Jeff, come on. Everybody knows what the purpose of business is. It's to make money." Or as we like to say in a slightly more sophisticated fashion in business school, to maximize the return on shareholder investment. And that is actually, although there have been some significant inroads on that over the last decade or two, that is actually still very much, I think, the dominant model of business purpose that's applicable in our broader business culture. Almost all public corporations operate with that in that framework. Many private corporations do. And I can tell you that almost all business curriculum is built on that foundation. It's a notion that says that fundamentally, as a leader, as a manager of business, your ultimate goal is to do anything that's within appropriate boundaries to maximize the return for the owners, for the shareholders, make as much money as you can to drive profits. The kind of patron saint of this view, who recently passed away, Milton Friedman, apparently, and actually some people have debated whether he ever said this, but it's such a great quote, I still use it. And he apparently at one point said, "Look, the business of business is business." So we as a business school kind of started with this assumption, but we began to sort of explore from a God's perspective, biblical perspective, is this right? And as we worked on this, we ended up concluding that this model, this dominant model, is at best insufficient and probably just wrong. And so I want to walk you through kind of quickly how it is that we ended up with a different set of purposes. So we decided that we were going to gather around looking at it through the lens of Scripture. There would have been a variety of different ways we could have done this, but we ended up deciding we would use the so-called grand narrative. As you know, Scripture itself is made up of lots of different genres, lots of little pieces of different poems and letters and biographies and apocryphal literature. It's all kind of mushed together. And typically when you'll hear a sermon or a talk, somebody will pull some story out or some piece and explicate it, and that's perfectly good. But we sometimes forget that if you stand back, that it tells one big story, Scripture, and that's often referred to as the grand narrative. And theologians debate about how best to divide this up into chapters, movements. We ended up deciding we'd go with a very conventional approach. We divided it into four parts: creation, fall, redemption, and new creation. And then basically what we did was we asked, what do each of these big movements teach us about business? How might they help us reflect more deeply about business? And when we were looking at the creation account, what we ended up discovering is that this was probably the best place to begin, at least, looking for this question on purpose. And you might wonder about that, because the creation account really is 2 chapters out of the entire Bible, which has got a lot of chapters. But from our vantage point, it made sense, because if you want to get a glimpse, and really that's all you'll get is just a glimpse, but if you want to get a glimpse of what God intended from the very beginning, before sin got in and messed everything up, it's Genesis 1 and 2 that gives you that picture. So that's where we started. I suspect many of you are very familiar with Genesis, and so I'm going to give you, and it's a university professor, I'm going to give you a quiz. So you pull out your pens. You won't have to share your score with anybody. It's a no risk quiz. But so let me hear. Okay, here we go. Here are your quiz questions. So first question. According to Genesis, it took God a week, literally or figuratively, to create the world. True or false? Make a little note. Next one. The Genesis account presents human beings as just one of the animal species. While Adam and Eve were the last to be created, they were not different in kind from the animals created before them. True or false? Genesis 1 through 3 demonstrates God's deep appreciation for diversity. True or false? Notice some of you are not writing. That will give you a very bad score. Technically, only Adam is said to have been made in the image of God. Adam and Eve were vegetarians. True or false? Adam and Eve were called to have dominion over the garden, to guard the garden, or both. Which of the following tasks were not assigned to Adam and Eve? Study and analyze creation, help one another flourish, live in relationship with God, grow to become like God, live in relationship with one another, cause the land to become more productive, or to protect the environment. People were made to work for a living as part of God's curse for Adam and Eve's disobedience in the garden. True or false? Because they were made in the image of God, human beings were made for relationships. True or false? The Genesis account emphasizes the creation of humanity as spiritual beings. True or false? And then last, Bonus question. As initially created, the Garden of Eden was perfect and complete. If Adam and Eve had not sinned, we would still be living in the garden, and it would look like it did when it was first created. True or false? All right. I could say, hand your papers to the person on your left, but we won't do that. Let's go back through them now. Here we go. According to Genesis, it took God a week. False. You remember that on the seventh day, God had finished the work. So he did it all in 6 days, because on the seventh day he rested, made holy. It's really where we derive our discipline of keeping the Sabbath. Genesis account presents human beings as just one of the animal species. This is false, and this is important, I think, for Christians these days, because there's a significant secular movement that wants to sort of elevate the rights of animals, the need to protect, prayers for all sentient beings, and often at its extreme, that becomes, hey, we're just another species, and to sort of preference human beings is a form of speciesism, which we should denounce. And from scriptural standpoint, that's just false. Adam and Eve were created in a different category. They were the only one to be given a mandate, a charge, and they were to have dominion over. So it was this kind of three-tiered. There's God, there's the rest of creation, and there's Adam and Eve. And so there are key distinctives, and we are not just the next or other species. Genesis 1-3 demonstrates God's appreciation for diversity, and I think the answer is yes. This is not from Genesis, but you can let the water teem with living creatures, let birds fly across the earth, the expanse of the sky. So God created the great creatures, the sea, and every living and moving things with which the water teems, according to their kinds, every winged bird according to its kinds. I'm sorry, this is from Genesis. And God saw that it was good. It is not good for man to be alone. I'll make a helper for him. Doesn't make a second Adam. He makes an Eve, a difference, so that out of that combination they can bring forth the work that he has for them. Technically, only Adam is said to have been made in the image of God. Be careful with this one, men. This is not true. So God created man, which is really humanity, in his own image. In the image of God, he created him male and female. He created him. There's something wonderful about the male-female that collectively reflects the image of God. Adam and Eve were vegetarians, little known, or at least little focused on. I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. Anybody know, off the top of your head, the first time human beings were authorized to eat meat? After the flood. Yeah, it was, I think, a concession that was made at that point. But originally, this was the plan. Adam and Eve were called to have dominion over the garden, yes, chapter 1. To guard the garden, yes, chapter 2. That is, they were to be told to do both. So, which of the following tasks were not assigned to Adam and Eve? So interestingly, to grow to become like God. This is a little bit nuanced because, of course, there is a sense in which we are to be emulating the holiness of God or whatever of God. But this was actually the temptation of the serpent. The serpent said, if you do, God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. All right, so I'm going to slow down now because now we're heading into the territory that I think is most relevant for our purposes. People were made to work for a living as part of God's curse for Adam and Eve's disobedience in the garden. This is false, and I like to start with this in terms of our big principles because I still am surprised how many Christians I run into who have this viewpoint. That somehow, Adam and Eve screwed up in the garden and God said, now you're going to have to work. And nothing could be further from the truth. If you go back and look at Genesis 1 and 2, you can just catalog all of the different tasks that were assigned to Adam and Eve. It's about a half a dozen of them that are listed. We sometimes roll those up together into the creation mandate as a way of describing it. But that means that work was fundamentally built into our identity as human beings. You can see this when you get down to this 26th verse in Genesis. This is a very famous verse. This is God speaking, let us make man, again, humanity, in our image, in our likeness. And theologians have debated for a long, long time about how much of the glory of the Creator could be carried, imaged by a mere creature, and there's a lot to think about there. But in a really simple-minded way, if you just start at the beginning of Genesis and read down to verse 26, you actually don't know very much about God to that point, except this. God was a worker. God created things. And every time he created something, he looked at it and he said, that's good. His work had meaning. And that means if you and I are made in the image of this God, we are made in part to express aspects of our identity in meaningful and creative work. So that was one of our first observations. We were made in part for work. Then we went on and we noticed that actually, back to the same verse, so here's back to our quiz. Because they were made in the image of God, human beings were made for relationship. That's true. Look at this verse again and notice the plurality of all of the pronouns there. And if you look at this verse back through the lens of the rest of Scripture, I think you see this is the very first place in Scripture where there's a reference to the Trinity. That is, we worship a God, one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who coexist eternally in a loving relationship one with another. And here's the key point. This relationship precedes any work that is done. The task of creating comes out of this relationship and then actually was intended to redound to the benefit of the relation, creates for the glory of God. And that this was God's pattern. Relationship precedes task. And the same then happens, it gets played out at the human level. God looks down, says, Adam's alone, that's not good, creates Eve, so that out of that relationship they can do the work to which God's called, and that the benefit of that work returns for them, to support them, to provide for their needs. And so this pattern of work coming out and returning to relationship gets established from the beginning. And so that was our second observation. Our work is to grow out of and return to relationship. So we looked at this and we said, hey, this is what business does. Business is really good at this. It brings people together in a whole lot of different kinds of relationships so that out of those relationships, meaningful and creative work can unfold. And so we thought, I'll bet that's on God's mission statement. And so we ended up saying, here's a first order purpose of business. Business exists to provide opportunities for individuals to express aspects of their God-given identities in meaningful and creative work. That's part of the answer to why business matters. Okay, so we went on. We're back to our quiz. The Genesis account emphasizes the creation of humanity as spiritual beings. You know, we talk a lot about spirit and souls, and there's certainly a lot in Scripture about that, but you'll be hard-pressed to find much of that ethereal stuff in Genesis 1 and 2. When God made the world, he made dirt and grasshoppers and sparrows. And each time he made one of these things, he looks at it again. He says, that's good. And that reminds us that the material world matters to God. That our God is not concerned just about saving souls. He's also concerned about feeding stomachs. And one of the reasons that I think that's so important for those of us that have worked in business is that by and large, business deals in material goods or services designed to meet material needs. And that stuff matters to God. So this was our third observation. The material world matters to God. Then our last quiz question. As initially created, the Garden of Eden was perfect and complete. False. This is one I screwed up the first time around. It still seems kind of odd to me. This is God's perfect design before sin messes anything up. How could it not be complete and perfect? And it was because I was thinking of perfection in static terms. That perfect is kind of like a postcard. And if only Adam and Eve hadn't disobeyed God, we'd still be in the garden wandering around, grapes falling in our mouths. This was God's beginning and desired end game. And it turns out that's not true. If you read it closely, Genesis 1 and 2, it is true that it is perfect, but it's perfectly resourced. It's ready to flourish. But it was never God's expectation that this is the end. This is where it would begin, but not where it would end. There's a verse in chapter 2, verse 5. This is the actual verse, but let me paraphrase for you. God says basically, there were fields, but yet no crops. Why? Two explanations. One, because God had not yet sent the rain, but also because as of yet there were no human beings available to work the ground. So what does that suggest? It suggests as part of God's perfect design, God intended to provide for the needs of the world, at least in part, through the work of human beings. that human beings were, and this is always a dangerous concept, so put it in quotes, they were to partner with God in causing the ground, this perfectly resourced starting point, to flourish, to bring forth the crops, to bring forth innovations, to bring forth new inventions. This was intended by God from the beginning to be part of what was going to take the perfectly resourced garden and move it forward. So we looked at those last two, I guess I should put it this way, those last two observations, and we said, that's interesting. What is that telling us? When you start with God's purpose on earth are to be advanced through our work, and it's often to deal with material needs, it reminded us that Martin Luther had said, that when we do the work that God has given us, we become God's hands in providing for the needs of the world. Now, of course, God did not have to set it up that way because God is God and God can do anything. God could have said instead, what I'm going to do is feed my people by dropping little flakes of bread down from heaven. He did that for a brief period of time. And if that was God's long-term plan, you and I would get very adept at going out for breakfast, and coming back at lunch. And there wouldn't be a lot of need for work because God was just doing it. But God didn't do that. God said, no, what I'd rather do is I'll create human beings who are capable of pooling their resources. We call that capital. So they can build an oven, technological design, gather supplies, supply chain, bake bread in operations, put it on trucks, logistics, and send it out to feed a hungry world. And that's what business does. Business becomes the hands and feet of God in providing for the material needs of the world. And so we said, that's interesting. I'll bet there's a second purpose on God's mission statement. Business exists to provide the goods and services needed to enable the community to flourish. Now, I don't want to suggest that business is the only institution that does this, but it is the dominant institution that does this. And from the standpoint of what's the purpose of business, we think this is on God's mission statement. So we put the two together. Business exists to provide goods and services and enable the community to flourish, and it exists to provide opportunities for individuals to express aspects of their God-given identities in meaningful and creative work. And that's it. There it is. That's the answer, we think, to the why question. Why business matters to God. Now, a lot of times when I get to this point in the talk, I find a certain sense of uneasiness in the group, and I can usually tell what this is about, and what it is about is because they want to ask, what about profit? I mean, that's, you remember, the dominant understanding. Come on, Jeff, you were like the dean of a business school. Your school didn't talk about profit or return on investment, and, we did. Of course, we were a very conventional business program in many respects. All those things, cost of capital, all that stuff. But here was the difference. We didn't teach profit as the end. We taught it as the means. Profit was the way in which a business would attract the capital that it needed in order to do these things that it's called to do. Good jobs, good products, to serve in that way. If you think about that for a minute, you will realize that I'm suggesting that we should turn the dominant paradigm from God's perspective upside down. Here's the dominant paradigm today. Dominant paradigm says that, yes, we should have good jobs. Why? Well, because it'll reduce, turnover, keep less expenses, more money for shareholders, owners. Yeah, we should have good products. We should be straight with our customers. Why? Well, builds brand loyalty, more sales, more money for the owners. In this case, good jobs, good products are the means of serving this higher goal of profit maximization. And I'm suggesting that from God's perspective, we ought to see it the other way around. That profit is the means of attracting capital that enables the business to do these first-order purposes, to provide good jobs and good services and good products. Sometimes when I get to this point, people will say, Jeff, you are mixing up not-for-profits with for-profits. A not-for-profit is supposed to be out there, doing good things, but a for-profit, well, that's for-profit. And I say, no, you're mixing up purpose and tactic. Because I think that not-for-profits and for-profits and these sort of new intermediary things, these social ventures, social enterprises, all of this stuff, in one way or another, and they're different ways, and they serve different constituencies, but they exist to serve. Now, they have very different tactics for funding their operations. A traditional not-for-profit comes to people like you and me and says, could I have more? Would you give me some more? Whereas a traditional for-profit funds its operations by generating revenues out of operations sufficient to pay a return to attract the capital that it needs. Very different tactics, but it doesn't change the sense of difference in purpose. Let me give you another way to think about it. Imagine that you could go out and find a large not-for-profit, I don't know, American Cancer Society, and you found the executive director of this and you said to her, why does your organization exist? Wouldn't it seem a little weird if she said, we exist to raise funds? You know, you'd probably expect her to say something like, we exist to promote scientific research into the cure of cancer or something. Now, you could ask a second question. What do you spend most of your time doing? Oh, we're always out trying to raise funds. Same is true of business. Why do you exist? We exist to serve in these two key ways. What do you spend most of your time doing? Oh my goodness, we have to focus manically on the bottom line. It is so hard to be profitable. I sometimes get accused of sort of denigrating profit or somehow suggesting that it's either unimportant or easy, and really nothing could be further from the truth. It is extraordinarily difficult to run a profitable business, particularly one over the long haul. I have huge respect and admiration for people. It takes hard work, it takes being able to think around the curve, it takes reasonable risks in the right time. It's tough, and it's a remarkable ability to be able to do that. It just isn't the purpose of the business. I'll give you one more way of thinking about it. Think about profit in a business like blood in your body. If blood is not pumping through your body, we really don't have to have a long discussion about your purpose for living, because you're dead. Similarly, if profit is not circulating through a business, we don't have to talk about its purpose, because it's bankrupt. But which of us gets up in the morning and says, today I'm going to live my life to pump blood? No, it's critically important, but it's not the purpose. The purpose of business is to provide goods and services that will enable the community to flourish and to provide opportunities for individuals to express aspects of their identities in meaningful and creative work. So let me kind of quickly go through a little chart that I have put together, because I've heard various different Christians talk to me about profit. I've already suggested that profit is not a first-order purpose, and by contrast, it is a means. It is an important component of the business. It's something that you need to focus on, but it is not your reason for existence. Sometimes I've heard people tell me that profit is a measure of my success. And frankly, I find this very objectionable, because if in fact, you will be more profitable if you align your business exactly with markets, with what the market wants to buy or how the market wants to function. And so the only way that profit could be a measure of success is if there is a complete alignment between market forces and God's will. And I don't believe that's true. We're going to spend some more time talking about that later this morning. But as long as you allow for the fact that God might be going this way at a time when the market might be going this way, then to say that profit is a measure of success doesn't make sense. Even worse from my standpoint is, I've heard it's a reward. It's a reward for what? I mean, Jesus was the most faithful, obedient person we've ever had on earth, and his reward was the cross. Why would we come away thinking that somehow my business will make more money just because I'm following Jesus? So I don't buy any of those. But I do think profit is, in addition to a means, a constraint. And we'll talk some more about that in the second talk. But there is a sense in which you can't, the business will be dead if it is not profitable. So the options you choose must be bounded by options that will allow you to operate at a profit. It is clearly a measure of one key business metric. It may not be a measure ultimately of success, but it's an important measure. Anybody that doesn't pay attention in running a business to whether or not they're profitable is likely not to be running a business very long. And then one other thing that I think is really worth mentioning is it's a sharpening tool. The need to generate a profit forces businesses to run leaner, more efficient, more sharply, in a way that is good and healthy for their long-term goals and missions. And so it is a useful tool to sort of bring out the best of a business, but I repeat, it is not ultimately the purpose of the whole thing. So that's kind of my answer to why. And I want to, in each of the sessions, I want to briefly do a yeah, but, because I will often get some objections to what I'm suggesting. And I want to quickly, I think I'm doing okay on time, quickly go through 3 of these objections that I'll hear. First, isn't it naive to build a business model on something other than profit? I mean, isn't this sort of profit-seeking, personal advantage, trying to always maximize, isn't that actually wired into the way human beings are designed? And you would be nuts to try to build a system around something other than that. And actually, I think that's just wrong. I think it misunderstands the complexity of human motivation. There's a book, and I don't particularly recommend it because I didn't find it generally helpful, but it had one really good part. It was called The End of Shareholder Value, Corporations at the Crossroad by a guy named Alan Kennedy. And the part that I really liked was he said, if you look at the companies that exist today, you know, with obvious lots of outliers, but if you look at the ones that exist today, they tended to have been formed mostly, there were clumps of formation. Once right at the beginning of the 20th century, so those are your old, venerable businesses. Once right after World War II, and then of course a number have been formed in the last few years. And he said, and obviously those aren't the only times businesses have been formed, but they kind of clumped in those 3 pockets. And if he said, if you go back and look at what motivated the founders and how they understood their purpose of their business in those different historical segments, you'll find it's quite different. In the very first one, the oldest one, businesses were typically family businesses initially. As they got bigger, there were more and more employees, but the employees were seen almost as an extension of the family. And so their values were family values. They wanted to be solid citizens in the community. They wanted to be at the table helping to shape and build their society. Yeah, they made money. They're still around. But no one would have said, our purpose in setting up this business is to make as much money as we can. Totally foreign concept in that context. For the group that was formed right after World War II, some of your new tech things, and these were people that just got excited about products. They just invented something that was really cool and that connected to something that they saw as a real need. They said, wow, we should have a business because I've got this cool thing and it could help meet this need. Yeah, they made money, but you didn't hear them saying, I'm here in order to maximize my return. It's really only in this last wave of businesses where you're finding people saying, I'm going to build a business so that I can flip it, so I can get out at an IPO, I can make as much money as I can, that the whole goal of this thing is to maximize my return. And so historically, this is not a sort of always been the model of business. It's a relatively new idea that maximizing your return is the purpose for business. It's also a socialized understanding. This is now a little bit old, but there was a study right at the turn of this century, a longitudinal study looking at MBA students. They went to the 11 top MBA programs in the country, and they did a survey of the students who were just about to start their MBA program. And they asked them a bunch of questions, including kind of how do you see the purpose of business? And they got really pretty broad answers at that point. They came back to these same students after 1 year in these high-end MBA programs, and they asked them, what do you see the purpose of business? Maximize shareholder return. It was a socialized, a taught perspective, not a given perspective. And so I don't think it's naive to build a model on something other than profit. And I think there are growing examples of ways in which this is working. Second question that I sometimes get, is this model actually workable in the real world? I mean, you know, Jeff, it makes me feel all warm and gooey for you to talk about service and all this stuff, but I'm in a business where I am manically competing with people who are just focused on nothing than squeezing that last dollar out. I just can't afford to be in any other kind of mode. Isn't this really not competitive? And when I answer this one, I always want to be careful because I don't want to suggest that you do this model that I'm proposing because it will pay off. I want to suggest you do this model because I think it's what God calls you to do. And I do not believe, even though we say it all the time in business school, that good ethics is always good business. And that's a nice phrase. It's true most of the time. You know, you treat your employees with respect, they're likely to stay with the company, reduce turnover, and that kind. So it's got a nice general truth, but it's not always true. Sometimes when you do the right thing, it costs you. And if that weren't so, we wouldn't teach ethics in business school. We would just have a second section of strategy. Here's another clever way to make more money. Sometimes doing the right things really does cost. And I would promote this model of business because it's the right thing. Now, having said that, I'll set that over here and say, I also actually think this thing will work pretty well in today's climate. There's a number of reasons, but I'll just hit one. Particularly today, when your new employees are millennials, who are people who by and large are searching for meaning. At the same time, most people will tell you that a real value of a corporation today is not found in the assets on its balance sheet, but they're all tied up in the initiative and the ingenuity and the creativity of the workforce. Successful businesses are the ones that unleash that. So, take a hypothetical. Imagine that you are running a business in Seattle. It's Monday morning. Seattle is gray and spitty and cold. Your whole team is assembled in the conference room. None of them have had their Starbucks coffee yet. They're all like this. And you say to them, today I want you to go out and give me every last ounce of creativity you can. One of them goes, why? So that we can maximize the return on our shareholder investment. I don't know, it doesn't seem very inspiring to me. But if you could say instead, because the work you're doing connects to this thing that is really important in our world, and your work will further that, I think you have hopes of really bringing out the best in your workforce. Jeff Immelt, who some of you know is the CEO of GE, he once said this. He said, to be a great company today, you also have to be a good company. The reason people come to work for GE is that they want to be about something that's bigger than themselves. They want to work for a company that makes a difference, a company that's doing great things in the world. Or kind of more recently, it's a quote from just a couple years ago. This guy named Elon Musk, who's the CEO of Tesla Motors and SpaceX. He says, technology leadership is determined by where the best engineers want to work. Now, I love these two lines. Putting in long hours for a corporation is hard. Putting in long hours for a cause is easy. I think this model actually links to this deep desire for meaning and purpose in all our lives, including our workforce. So the last one, why does this matter so much? And here, I've already suggested that the business community, I think, needs a more robust theology, but I'm thinking here in deeper terms, and there are several answers that I would have, but in the interest of time, I'm going to just focus on one, and that is this. We have a world that, as you know, is loaded with big problems. And you know all these kind of stats. 20% of the world population lives in extreme poverty. We have, I think somebody was telling me, 30 wars going on at this time. We have massive sort of climate, temperatures are climbing. Whole continents ravaged by epidemics. This is a statistic that constantly shocks me. And it's about 2 years old and it's been getting better, but broadly, over 17,000 children under the ages of 5 die every day from largely preventable causes. If you want to give yourself some sense of order of magnitude, that means in less than a month, every month, month after month, we lose in children the population of the city of Minneapolis. We have huge problems out there in the world. And it's not like nobody's been paying attention to them. The United Nations, governments, NGOs have been working on these things. But I'm convinced that these problems are too big for those institutions to handle alone. The institution in society that has the biggest capacity to change the world is business, just by scale. The problem right now is that business leaders think they're being taught that their purpose in business is to kind of keep their eye focused on this bottom line instead of looking out at the horizon. But it doesn't have to be that way. People could choose to do it differently. Instead of asking, when you're looking at a variety of options, which of these options is likely to most likely to maximize my ROI, we could instead start with a different question. given the core competency of my organization, given the assets under my control, how might I best deploy them profitably in service of some of the world's big problems? Now, I emphasize profitably because I think it's wonderful when businesses go places and build schools or orphanages, and that's fine, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about as you are designing your business, as you're thinking about what products you're going to sell, knowing that you need to be able to do so on a profitable basis, are there ways that you could orient them towards solving some of these big problems in our world? I think there are. I think those opportunities are out there over and over and over, and we miss them because we're looking for the wrong answer, or we're asking the wrong question. Business leaders have great skills. They're the best at getting the most out of a little. They can organize, deploy resources with remarkable efficiency. They tend to be optimistic by demeanor. When other people see obstacles, they see opportunities. They look for these third way, the win-wins. They are inclined to persevere intensely when they're convinced that they're on the right path. And so I actually think that the business of business is not business. The business of business is serving the world. And God needs business. The world needs business. Let me end this particular session by quoting to you a verse that I'm sure you've heard many times. It comes from Luke 10. Jesus is surveying the farmland, the fields around him, and he's talking to his disciples, and he says, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." I grew up always thinking what that was talking about was missionaries and pastors. I'm now convinced it's business leaders too. Pray the Lord to send business leaders into the world, armed with this desire to serve, and the world will change. So, thus endeth our first talk.
Thank you, Jeff. That was wonderful.